How do we write Jewish histories of the Middle East? The extreme violence of the present moment and the ways in which Zionism has become the most dominant narrative for making sense of Jewish life in the past makes this question one of considerable urgency. Jews have been part of Middle Eastern history for thousands of years. At times, Jewish communities, like other communities in the Middle East, have suffered hardships. At other times, Jewish communities in the Middle East have thrived. And Jews have played a significant role and have made significant contributions to social, cultural, political, and economic life in the region, particularly in the modern period. In my own research, I focus on how Jews, particularly in Iraq, played a prominent and dominant role in Iraq's early cinema industry. And this is a familiar story all over the Middle East. Today, we will hear from Dr. Eirik Kvindesland, who will add a very interesting perspective from the Persian Gulf. Eirik holds a PhD from the University of Oxford, where he is currently a postdoctoral associate. Eirik is a historian of Middle Eastern Jewish history, a topic on which he has already published several important articles. He's also currently writing a book in Norwegian on the relationship between Iran and Israel, which we all look very much forward to. And his talk today is entitled Jews of the Persian Gulf, the Making of an Oceanic Network and Its Meaning for Middle Eastern History, 1820 to 1914. And I hope you'll join me in welcoming Eirik.
Thank you, Pelle. Thanks for those kind introductory words. This is the first time, or technically it's second time, but this is the first lecture, first iteration of my doctoral research that I get to have a chance to present outside of my own home university. So it's quite an exciting opportunity to take this out of the kindergarten and out into the real world and see how it floats. So thank you very much for coming and joining in. So my doctoral research dealt with Jewish history in the Persian Gulf, roughly from 1890 until 1948. So very much the modern period. But while doing that, I realized there was a lot going on in the 19th century that I initially did not know about, that I only discovered through reading primary sources, diaries, personal narratives, etc. And the things that I'm going to talk about today is mainly the result of those discoveries that kind of preceded my own initial interests. Yeah. So I'll start by telling a little anecdote to kind of set the frame. And we'll start out with a TV series. So during Ramadan of 2020, 4 years ago, the TV series Harun aired in the Arab Gulf states. It was a TV series set in a Jewish community in some fictional Arab Gulf society during the 1940s, centering on the community doctor, Harun, an elderly lady. And as Arab-Jewish conflict escalated in Palestine, she continued to tend to her Muslim, Christian, and Jewish patients. And even when the State of Israel was created in 1948, the Jewish community in this fictional Gulf society remained at peace with its neighbors, despite the growing regional tensions. And to my knowledge, this was really the first time that a Jewish culture, a Jewish society was depicted on Arab television as an integral part of Gulf society. This TV series immediately created an enormous uproar. Critics viewed it as a sign that Gulf governments, to a great extent, control the media in the Gulf, were preparing the public for normalizing diplomatic relations with the State of Israel, and at the same time abandoning their old solidarities with the Palestinians. Allegedly, stories and narratives like the series Harun could help them do so under the pretext of tolerance and religious coexistence. And while a lot of this criticism initially seemed far-fetched, it was not entirely out of place. Only months later, both Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates both signed peace agreements with Israel, brokered by our beloved US President Donald Trump and his assistants, in what would eventually become known as the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were framed by all parties as a reconciliation between Islam and Judaism, as a real coming together and peacemaking of religions, with the existence of Gulf Jews, both past and present, and especially in Bahrain, where there is still today a Jewish community, serving as the ultimate proof that this peace between Islam and Judaism was possible. So almost overnight, the Jewish community of Bahrain, a small community of 30 people, had been thrown into the spotlight of Middle Eastern geopolitics. The community was instrumentalized as a legitimating narrative for what was otherwise a very controversial diplomatic agreement that mainly centered on security policy and intelligence cooperation, etc. And in the public sphere, these sudden changes opened a range of historical and cultural and political questions. Who were these Gulf Jews who now suddenly came to play such an important political role? Where did they come from? What was their relationship to Zionism? And to put it more simply and more succinctly, who was the real Harun and where did she come from originally? And these questions have, in different versions and iterations, these questions have been at the core of my doctoral research. My initial interest was sparked by these issues here. So this pulled me into the literature. I had to go back and see if there was actually anything written about Gulf Jews. We can start with a brief look at sort of these general regional histories of the Persian Gulf. There's a classic in Arabic called El Khalij al-Arabi, Bahr al-Asatir, the Persian Gulf, or the Arab Gulf, excuse me, the Sea of Legends, written by Qadri al-Khalaji in the 60s, a classic pan-Arabist account, which essentially seeks to claim the entire Gulf space as an Arab space that belongs to the Arab world. And conversely, on the Iranian side, we have similar books, the other one here, Al-Khalij al-Fars, Khalij al-Fars, that seek to claim the Gulf as a Persian space. Interestingly enough, neither of these nationalist accounts mention Jews at all. And these are just two examples. It's also a general trend. And the same also goes for more nationally oriented histories of Gulf states. If you read national histories of Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and even of Iran, Iranian books dealing with southern coast, you'll find very few mentions of Jews at all. Interestingly, this silencing of a Jewish history that I hope to convince you was actually an important part of modern Gulf history has also taken place within Jewish history writing. In the Hebrew Zionist history establishment centered around the Zionist movement, centering around research institutes in Jerusalem, the Hebrew University, there is an extensive literature dealing with Jewish communities in the modern Middle East, generally known in Hebrew as Edot HaMizrach, or communities of the East. Most famously, this approach is represented here by a book by Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, a famous Zionist Orientalist and one of Israel's presidents, who wrote a book called Nidrei Israel, meaning the remnants of Israel, viewing Middle Eastern Jewish communities as leftovers scattered around the Middle East, leftovers from a previous bygone glorious period that now had to be rediscovered by the modern Zionist project. Same goes for English language literature. Neither of these make particular mention of Gulf Jews, mainly focused on national communities, Iranian Jews, Iraqi Jews, etc. But this situation has changed more recently. We have here two very recent or quite recent publications that have come out within the last 10 years or so. We have, for example, one here called El Yahud fil Khalij by Yusuf Ali al-Mutairi, written in 2015 or 16, published in Kuwait, which is a regional history of Jews in the Gulf, mainly based on online research and scattered some published archival documents, most of them in English and Arabic. We also have a very similar account here. The interesting thing with these books is that even though they initiate a conversation on Gulf Jewish history, thankfully, they're also driven by an impulse to cocoon Jewish communities as small religious entities disconnected from wider political histories of the societies they lived in. Both of these books argue that Jews had an integral role, an integral place in Gulf societies, but there's at the same time entirely disconnected from politics, entirely disconnected from imperialism. None of these books mention Zionism, although there is a blue star of David on the cover that might hint towards the state of Israel. While these issues are obviously linked to also problems of academic freedom in the countries they were written, it's still worthwhile keeping in mind that the silencing that took place in previous literature endures within a lot of the newer literature as cocooning or isolation of the topic from more controversial issues. So building on these nationalist literatures of the Gulf, books that look at the Gulf as a Persian Gulf, other books that look at the Gulf as Arab, made me think that, well, what should we call the Gulf? Can I use the word Persian Gulf, or do I have to find some more neutral term? Clearly, the choice of name depends on whose history you want to write. If you're writing the history of Arabs, you go for the Arab Gulf, and vice versa with the Persians. So the question then was kind of obvious. Like, if you're going to write about Jewish history, was there ever a Jewish Gulf? Are there such a thing as Gulf Jews? And keep in mind that now I'm not talking, before anyone accused me of Zionist conspiracy, I'm not talking about a territorial, a state Jewish Gulf, but can we think of such a history, such a cultural world, a life world of a Gulf, a Jewish Gulf? This was worth thinking about, and I consider Gulf Jews as a research category here. It's not just about people who happen to live in the Gulf, Jews who happen to live in this place, but I also use this as a way to work around the historical silencing that I've been talking about. The term Gulf Jews seeks to account for the cultural hybridity between Jews that originated from Arab and Persian cultural spaces, both within Iran and within Iraq, and merged these two cultural spheres with Jewish culture in an oceanic space. So it's a way to try and grasp this specific culture. And it's also important to create a language, a terminology that allows Jews in the Gulf to exist also as Gulfis or Khalijis, as people of the Gulf, in addition to being Jews, in the sense that we shouldn't exaggerate their Jewishness. Their Gulfiness might be just as important. So I've been talking a lot about literature and concepts and words. Let's get to some actual history. So the story that I'm going to tell today is set in the 19th century imperial Gulf. I think of the Gulf as a corner of the Indian Ocean. Most Middle East historians, at least until recently, have generally thought about the Gulf as Middle Eastern. Kind of understandable if we define the world through territorial maps. But if we think of it through oceanic history, the Persian Gulf is actually a corner of the Indian Ocean. The fact that it's cut off by a narrow strait in Hormuz between the Emirates and Iran doesn't really make a big difference. And in that sense, we include the Gulf within an Indian Ocean historiography of communities, migration, and connectivity. In the 19th century, the Gulf, Persian, Arab, or Jewish, whatever you want to call it, was under overlapping governance of three empires. So I have quite a bad map here. Don't take it too literally, but it's just intended to give a general sense. With the Qajar Empire in Iran in light green, the Ottoman Empire in slightly darker green, and Britain coming in from its crown colony in India from the east, both the red and the sort of red-white stripes there. Three empires to varying degrees contesting authority within the Gulf. And here I lean on a term by Indian Ocean historian Sugata Bose, who thinks of these kind of imperial contestations as overlapping or layered imperial sovereignties. In the sense that there was no clear boundary between these empires. It was not given where the governance of one stops and where the other one starts. Especially in the port cities, one could see a continuous process of negotiating sovereignty and negotiating control, with subjects in many cases having passports in two empires at the same time, and using the one that would happen to be most suitable in that particular case. The important thing with Britain here is that the British Empire enters the Gulf in 1820, roughly in the 1820s, by signing protectorate agreements with Arab tribes in what is back then called the Trucial Coast, today the United Arab Emirates. So Britain never claims full territorial control in any parts of the Gulf, but it enters into indirect governance structures by entering into alliances with local rulers, which a kind of indirect rule that is very much focused on cities, and that further propels this system of overlapping and intertwined governance. As we will see, this system was very, very important for the presence of Jews in the 19th century Gulf. So to sketch out more precisely what I'm talking about here, when I say Jewish migration to the Persian Gulf, I'm talking about a gradual move of people from interior Iran, interior Iraq, and or Ottoman and Qajar Empire, and the hinterland around the Gulf towards the Gulf ports between the 1820s and the 1880s. This was not some kind of exodus. It was not a large-scale migration, but a small trickle of people from the hinterland towards the Gulf ports. One of the most famous narratives of this trickle, this migration, would be the escape of the Sassoons, the very rich and successful trading family of Baghdad, who was tightly connected to the Mamluks who ruled Baghdad until the 1830s. As the Ottoman Empire sought to regain full authority over Baghdad and Ottoman Iraq, the Mamluks lost power, and at the same time the Sassoons fell out of favor with the state, and therefore escaped from Baghdad towards the Gulf, had a brief period in Bushehr, in the port here, before moving onwards to India. A story that has been recounted in various books of Jewish history and sort of more adventurous stories of the Sassoon family. But this was just one iteration of a general trend. Families leaving interior Ottoman Empire and interior Qajar Iran, driven by push factors such as imperial reassertion. So the imperial center, being that Istanbul or Tehran, reasserting increasing control over their peripheries and over the local rulers that would be controlling the periphery, leading to a political turnover, a complete upending of local networks of patronage, local business networks, who controlled what, who allowed who to market their goods where. A particularly sorry development for merchant Jewish families. Muslim-Jewish tension was also, to a certain extent, an issue, particularly in Shiraz, here in Iran. Shiraz being one of southern Iran's biggest cities, if not the biggest. A place where European imports, European industrial goods, textiles, spices from India, etc., a surging import of goods coming from the British Empire, essentially wreaked havoc in the local economy and overturned local production. To a certain extent, local Muslim merchants associated this with Jewish merchants and viewed Jews as the agents of foreign produce that destroyed the local economy. The reality was not that simple, but that was a narrative that increasingly led to tensions between Muslim and Jewish communities, mainly in Shiraz, but also in other places. Note here that we're not talking about anti-Semitism here. There is no exodus, there's no driving out of Jews. This is a general small-scale migration. The majority of people who lived in these cities that I'm talking about now did not move to the Gulf. So we're looking at a minority phenomenon here. And to understand why that happened, let's look at the pull factors. I mentioned the India trade, the textiles and the spices, etc. The trade coming from places like Basra, Bushehr, Bahrain, going out of the Gulf towards Bombay and other British Indian cities, leading to a massive surge in trade volumes. These were old trade routes that preceded the British Empire by centuries, but just simply the scale and the mass of goods increased enormously, making the ports favorable spots for trade. These were places to get rich, essentially, thanks to the enormous flow of trade. Typically, this would mean opium, alcohol, to a certain extent, carpets being exported from the Gulf ports, and white textiles, Indian spices, other things being imported through these ports. So far, these have been fairly general factors. But when it comes to the next point, British patronage, a specifically Jewish story comes in here. Because the British Empire was not some sort of religiously secular neutral broker coming into the Persian Gulf. The British Empire had a specific preference for Jews. British colonial officials viewed Middle Eastern Jews in slightly religious, nostalgic terms as remnants of the Bible, sometimes even as poor Jews who were lost in a sea of Islamic fanaticism that had to be saved and protected by Europeans. And this led to a British practice of extending judicial protection over Jews, in some cases by protecting them physically against attacks, also by handing out passports, residency documents, giving travel permits to India, for example. It could also be simply employment in a British consulate, in a British, or it could be representation of a British business. All these types of commercial judicial relations that over time attached Jews to the British Empire, or to British entities. And this also came with major advantages for Jews. Jewish communities could move to Bushehr and gain British business connections and thereby access to a growing world market, trade across the Indian Ocean, trade with India. Many of them trade with London, a huge potential compared to local economic practice in inland cities and villages. And the British also had their benefits from this. It was very much thought of in strategic terms, in addition to the religious nostalgia that I just talked about. Many British colonial officials explicitly went to villages where they heard about Muslim-Jewish scuffles taking place. They would move in, claim to protect the Jews, and at the same time ensure that trade through the village happened through Jewish merchants who were attached to British interests in a way, as a way of displacing Russian, French interest as part of general imperial rivalry. Drink some water before I dry out. So now we're going to move on to two specific Gulf port cities to see how these trends played out locally. So we'll start by talking about Bushehr. Bushehr was, by the mid-19th century, the largest trading port in the Gulf, and especially in Iran, the major importing port for imports and exports to Iran. And from 1822, it became home to the British Residency, which was the administrative office from which Britain managed its interests and its presence in the Gulf. After a while, there were also even naval detachments and warships placed in Bushehr. Although the city nominally was on part of the Qadar Empire, Britain had a permanent, relatively permanent military presence there. And the trends or the tendencies that I talked about earlier over time led there to emerge a mixed Baghdadi Persian Jewish community in Bushehr. We have sources of travelers and people going through the city in the 1820s reporting there to hardly be any Jews in the city. whereas other accounts from the 1880s and the 1890s speak of a huge, rich, prosperous Jewish community that even supported and sustained Jewish communities elsewhere. And part of my argument here is that these immigrants who came from other communities elsewhere around the Gulf, in Bushehr developed a specific Gulf Jewish way of life, specific types of food that mixed Jewish dietary requirements with the availability of foods in the Gulf, typical kinds of fish, Jewish ways of preparing Persian Gulf fish, ways of performing religious rituals. We have, for example, accounts of Jewish ritual baths, normally done with fresh water, sweet water, where available. But in a dry city like Bushehr on the Persian Gulf coast was done with salty water from the sea. So salt water ritual immersion baths. I know this might be very specific, but it's one of the many things that indicate that there's a specific way of living Jewish lives in the Gulf. In terms of hard numbers, we're talking about a community that peaked in the 1880s, 90s with around 2,000 individuals, estimated to be some 20% of the population. Might not seem like a huge number, but this was the 19th century in a sparsely populated part of the world, and in relative terms, quite a significant community. We're going to get to a primary source here that gives us a sense of this kind of community and its global connections. This excerpt here is written by Raphael Chaim HaKohen, a Persian rabbi who migrated through Bushehr on his way to Jerusalem in the 1890s. And he later published his memoir in Hebrew and wrote about Bushehr. In the city of Bushehr, there are about 500 families of our people. Most of them are well-to-do, and among them are great merchants who trade with the cities of India, Basra, Baghdad, London, and other European cities. Among them are also representatives of the great shipping companies operating on these coasts. Most of them are traders and money exchangers and work within the city itself. So Raphael Chaim HaKohen, he was in awe about the Jewish community in Bushehr. He wrote pages and pages about how rich they were, how they drank expensive coffee instead of tea, how the candles in their synagogues were the biggest candles he'd ever seen, and generally more of their expensive consumption habits. And although none of this gives us hard numbers, it's a clear sense that there was general Jewish prosperity in Bushehr. He also noted how their safety was guaranteed by the British resident. And just to give you a little coloring here you see the name Bushehr written in written in Hebrew in the local Rashi script, the Hebrew handwriting used by Middle Eastern Jews at the time. Now we'll move over to Bahrain, the cosmopolitan island on the other side of the Gulf, on what we may call the Arab side of the Gulf. A smaller place, smaller city, where Jews arrived approximately in the 1890s. We don't have many sources about this, but the general trend seems to be that the growth in the pearl trade attracted both Jewish merchants and other merchants. So Bahrain quickly became home to an expansive pearl fisheries that exported pearls to the global market. And the presence of also here a British consul who operated protective agreements with a local sheikh ensured particularly favorable trading arrangements. British rule in Bushehr generated what has by various historians been called dual rule, or double rule, dual rule, which meant that local residents were subjects of the local sheikh, whereas foreigners were subjects of the British Empire. So if you move to Bushehr with a Persian passport or an Ottoman passport, you would automatically be subject to British law and not local Bahraini law. A very particular interesting system that led to enormous conflict and endless litigation in courts and in political assemblies over who should actually be considered local, who should be taxed, who should be considered a foreigner, who was free to go, who could come. And Jewish communities coming in, or Jewish merchants and migrants coming in from Qajar Iran or from the Ottoman Empire were subject to both of these protections, being foreigners, but also being Jews. So we go to a primary source here from 1906, when the local sheikh, Isa ibn Ali, tried to tax the local Jewish community. Considering them to be locals, they've been living there for several years, trading out in and out of Manama, and the local sheikh wanted to tax them. They immediately went to the British representative, to the British consul, and claimed to be considered foreigners. So I'll just read out from the source here. I was aware, however, that the British government took considerable interest in the welfare of the Jews of Persia, to the extent even of occasionally intervening diplomatically on their behalf. And I therefore felt little doubt that they would expect me to assist the Bahrain Jews in any difficulty which might beset them on account of their religion, and to demand their exception from appearing in the court of the Qazis. The court of the Qazis here meaning the local Islamic court system. And after having met the Jewish community to discuss the affair with them, he further wrote, "There is not the slightest doubt that all the adult Jews of Bahrain are foreigners by birth, and they inform me that they have no intention of making their domicile permanently in Bahrain. I think, therefore, that the Turkish and Persian governments would have strong grounds for objecting to their Jewish subjects in Bahrain being treated as badly as are the subjects of the chief or the sheikh himself." Yeah. So here we see the Jewish community very actively invoking their foreignness, although they're staying in Bahrain, and history would later show that they do make Bahrain their domicile. They stay there for a long time, but they still invoke their foreignness. And as we can see from the local political residence document, are protected by the British presence, both by virtue of being Jews and by virtue of being foreigners. And with such compelling grounds for protection, no wonder that a Jewish community emerged in Bushehr. If you could trade across the British imperial sphere while having two forms of judicial protection, exempting you from taxes and protecting you from local jurisdiction. And my argument here is that the emergence of these now I spoke about two communities, but there were others as well in other ports in the Gulf, over time led to the emergence of a Gulf Jewish network. So these would be the same families who were spread around in these various cities. We have Bushehr, Bahrain, Kuwait, Basra, to a certain extent Muhammara as well, a small community in Bandar Abbas, further south in the Gulf, who trade with each other, maintain family connections, and also religious connections. For example, when the first synagogue was built in Bahrain, the Torah scrolls were donated from the synagogues in Bushehr. When Jewish children were getting their bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs in Bahrain, they would travel across the Gulf to have these religious services performed by the rabbis of Bushehr. So we can see a continuous exchange here, driven by the fact that they were so mobile. One could travel across the Gulf. If the winds were favorable, one could travel across in one day. So this was very much an interconnected space where suitable for networks. And I argue that this Gulf Jewish network peaked in the 1890s. That's when it was the most active, but it persisted in certain respects into the 1940s, enduring through periods of change, territorialization, new borders, new political regimes, but it still remained with us well into the modern age. This running of a network was not particularly Jewish, and we should therefore look at this network as one of many ethnic networks along the Indian Ocean rim, We have various histories of Muslims, Armenians, Parsis, Zoroastrians who run similar networks, not necessarily in the Persian Gulf, but in other parts of the Indian Ocean. Yemenis, Hadramis from Yemen, who also operate these global ethnically based networks across the ocean. And the argument here is also that because this network building, community building, is not specifically Jewish, it's arguably Khaliji, it's Gulfi. And that's what makes this Gulf Jewish networks. It's mixed Persian-Arab origin, its cultural hybridity, and its mobility over the ocean, driven by, oceanic connectivity and mobility. What is interesting is that this network was so potent and so powerful that it very quickly expanded much further, way beyond the Persian Gulf. And we now move to Jerusalem, a city, a mountainous city, located some 700 meters above sea level, relatively far away from ports. That was unbelievably so also included in this network at some point. In the 1860s, the Suez Canal opened and effectively connected the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. A few decades later, steam shipping routes were functionally operating, most of them British managed, sailing between the Gulf ports and Suez in Egypt, and some of them even going all the way to Jaffa in Ottoman Palestine of the period. And these forms of new imperial oceanic connectivities had an enormous impact upon Jewish communities in the Gulf and in southern Iran. Suddenly, Jerusalem changed from being a religious vision, a religious possibility, to becoming a real city, a real place where one could actually migrate without spending one's entire fortune and risking one's life. The Suez Canal, the steamships that went through it, allowed rabbis in southern Iran and the Gulf to travel to Jerusalem within less than 2 weeks, with relatively low risk. And this led to the emergence of a Persian Jewish community in Jerusalem. Persian Jews had for a long time gone to Jerusalem in smaller numbers. There were rabbis in northern Palestine, in Safed. There were also Persian rabbis in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. But from the 1890s, something quantitatively different emerges. Large groups of 100 to 200 people would go with young rabbis, leaving Shiraz, leaving Bushehr, traveling around the Arabian Peninsula, across the Indian Ocean, and actually settling in Jerusalem. Not simply going there for pilgrimage or a visit, but actually settling in the place. Showing how the link of the Mediterranean and the Indian Oceans actually also linked Jewish communities and engendered the emergence of new Jewish communities. As a little piece of evidence here, we have a picture from what is today known as Beit HaKnesset Ulei Bushehr, which means the synagogue of the Bushehr immigrants, which is still today present in Jerusalem, built in the 1890s by these first immigrants. Very much a small remnant that has now long faded out of Zionist history and from the grander narratives of Jewish migration to Ottoman Palestine, but nevertheless one very interesting corner that links this Jewish growth, population growth in Palestine to a much farther away network in the Gulf. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? Okay. A little more. Okay. I hope that's okay. Okay, so changes in the Gulf Jewish network. How did it end? How did it change? We'll explicate that by looking at a little primary source again from Bushehr and what I call the Bushehr School Affair. So in 1908, we find this document behind me here in the archives of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the AIU archives, which was a French philanthropic organization that was present in large parts of the Middle East, seeking to promote education and enlightenment, or what they called enlightenment, among local Jewish communities. This letter here is written in Judeo-Persian. So it's Persian language written in Hebrew characters, also in very poor handwriting. It took me weeks to decipher the text, which is essentially a pledge for funding. So this is the local Jewish community in Bushehr asking the Alliance Israélite Universelle to fund a new school for them because their local school has run out of funds and it's not operating anymore, and they want a school for their children. And this I'm not going to go into the details of the text because it's quite hard to untangle. But this document tells us a lot. First of all, economic decline. I mean, this was one of the richest Jewish communities in the area only a few decades earlier. Now trade routes have shifted. Oil is about to be discovered in other parts of the Gulf. The economy is shifting away from Bushehr. And clearly, one of the richest communities now have to ask for charity to run their own school. The fact that it's written in Judeo-Persian also suggests to us that now the city is more dominantly Persian than Baghdadi or Iraqi. Previously, many of the community seniors would be of Iraqi origin and would either write Judeo-Arabic or Arabic, and now it's entirely in Persian, with the signatures here of most of the community notables, signaling that the Baghdadis have left. They have gone somewhere else. And my hunch is that they all went to India and to Mumbai, where there were greater fortunes to be made than in Bushehr. And these departures, this decline of population is also very much present in other documents. We have, for example, a report by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, who sent a representative to the city. Having 25 to 30,000 inhabitants, Bushehr used to have quite an important Israelite community. But after persecutions and innumerable exactions in Shiraz, the sectarian tension we talked about earlier, a flow of immigration towards the Holy Land, or La Terre Sainte, has formed. This exodus has reduced the Israelite population of Bushehr to 300 souls. Similarly, local Persian government officials, when writing about the Jewish community, a local governor from 1914, lately, the Jews have been busy emigrating to Jerusalem, or Quds Sharif in Persian, and the Levant, and become fewer. In Bushehr, there are now money exchangers, spice dealers, and produce date arak, or booze, essentially. So a clear sense of change here. Okay, since I only have a few minutes left, we'll try and round off. Going back to the question of a Jewish Gulf, or a Gulf of Jews, or Gulf Jews, I think the existence of these communities and the existence of this network clearly shows the use of thinking about Jewish history through the prism of the Gulf. There is a distinct society and culture that comes into light if we look at the area through this lens. Whether this Gulf was Jewish, I don't have any strong opinions on that. I've never seen any Jewish documents speaking of the Gulf as Jewish, but it's more than sufficient to say that there was a Gulf Jewish culture here. This obviously adds a lot of diversity to the history of the Gulf, a space that is very commonly understood as conservatively Islamic, inserting religious diversity, cultural diversity, and also showing that this hybrid Arab-Persianate cultural mix that emerged here at the line between the Persianate and Arab world also extended into Jewish lives, particularly in the 19th century. And the connectivity, the wide range of links that this network made across the Indian Ocean also should affect the way we think about Jewish history and modern Jewish immigration to Palestine and to Jerusalem, not as something exclusively coming from Europe, driven by Zionism and colonial designs, but also as driven by connectivity and religious aspirations coming from other parts of the world, and thereby diversifying Zionist and Jewish histories of modern Palestine and the modern Middle East. I think it's also more generally about networks. The Gulf Jewish network very much shows that histories of networks shouldn't only be about those who moved and those who connected, but also those who were left behind. We see here that the network essentially ravaged the communities that remained in the Gulf, who were essentially if not abandoned, maybe they could have gone themselves, but their lives were never the same after connectivity took away so many of their family members and co-religionists. So in that sense, I think it's useful to think about the history of the Gulf, the Jewish history, but also a general history of networks in the Indian Ocean. So with that, I think I'll end here. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Pour you a glass of water before we started. I left you thirsty. I think
I'll pour you one.
Okay, thank you. I think Bergen is a very fitting place to have a conversation about oceanic networks. You know, here we are in Khalij Bergen with an audience that includes some of our colleagues who are experts on Jewish history, who are experts on the history of the Indian Ocean. So I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation. I have several questions, but I'd like to give a chance to the audience to ask questions first. We do have a microphone somewhere, I think. So yes, wonderful. Are there any questions? Yes, we can start with Anna and then Knut. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Eirik, for the fascinating talk. It's really amazing to sort of think, of course, that everything that you present here about the Gulf Jewish community is extremely familiar from the other communities who operated in a very similar way, right? And you mentioned them yourself. There was one thing that kept coming up in your talk, and which raises the same question regarding specific Arab networks as well, and that's India. And you said, oh, they migrated to India, or the networks extended to India. And I always wondered if do you see in this case that there is a kind of overlap in the way that these networks are established? Because when you look at the Hadramis, they do form their own communities and they become self-recruiting kind of. But there's also clearly more than that. You know, it doesn't only happen inside a community. I was reminded of the book by Mai al-Nakib, if you know that one.
I'm sorry?
That's a novel by Mai al-Nakib. It's on the Kuwaiti family. I think it's a Sunni family and their networks and how it extended to India. It's really interesting. And she also describes that although they're Sunni, sometimes they would rely on, you know, related families who are not necessarily of their community, especially when it comes to India. So I was just wondering if you see some of the same with the Jewish communities.
So in terms of the establishment of the communities, we have very few sources. These are mostly memoirs and quite often written a few generations after. So they tend to center on a man, a merchant who goes somewhere for commercial opportunity, and then the community sort of emerge around him. I'm sure the reality is a bit more complex, but that tends to be the narratives that I've been able to access. Of course, if it's one guy initially going by himself or with his own family, there's no way that he can run a network all by himself. So they're evidently trading with locals of other religions and other communities. So although, yeah, although I didn't highlight that much here, there is a lot of interaction happening between these Jewish communities and with other religions, other ethnicities as well, which further underlines the point that this is not something exclusively Jewish. So yeah, I can only say that the slightly looking at this also outside of the Jewish angle is very fruitful in terms of the way communities interact with others as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going the other way. I'm looking at this as a Jewish community as part of my first question. I think you partially answered already at the beginning. That was when you got in the Bushehr, you got Baghdadi Jews and Persian Jews, and my question would be, what language did they actually talk as a community? And you to answer that by saying that they wrote in Persian and the Baghdadis wrote in Arabic. So they were bilingual in Arabic and Persian, but did they have a community language? You had this first of your direct quotes was in Hebrew, but that was a book published in 1970. So you have no idea what kind of language this guy wrote in 1899, whether actually Hebrew was still used. But that's one thing. Question now, are they all completely, bilingual? So they might be using each other's languages, no problem. But the other question, more theoretical or whatever, is looking. This is, of course, a period of change, which you can call modernization or westernization or something. And I'm thinking also of what Pelle earlier has described for us of the Jews in the early 20th century or mid 20th century in Iraq, who get the impression from the pictures he's shown as a kind of westernized, modernized thing. And that is also when you see these people you are talking about, they're floating from Baghdad, from a Jewish society there, to Basra, then to the Bushehr, and then to India. So they have become that's kind of a modernized, I think of it as a kind of modernized type of network creation. So is there can you think of it as kind of that the Jewish communities you are talking about are moving towards the westernized, modernized, Britishized, eventually when they end up in India, a culture and identity faster than the Arab communities, Muslim Arab communities that are surrounding them? So that's one question. Whether it is a kind of increased separation between the Jews and the non-Jews in terms of their ability to become internationalized because they have the international links. That is maybe why they are moving quickly out of the area, because they have the possibility. They already have the links maybe in India or in Europe or wherever. And the other one is the question of the Jewish who didn't go. Is there a social component to this? So that you're talking about a particular type of Jews who are really defined by the fact that they were traders. They had money, they had ability. And that, whatever the answer to my first question is, depends on what kind of social relation the Jewish community you are talking about in Baghdad, or for that matter, in Iran. That are those who don't go through this kind of modernization period, development.
Yeah, I think that's three questions. So to start out with language, I think it's a tricky question. So we have some sources that suggest when the network really peaks, that in Bushehr, the services in the synagogues were conducted in the Baghdadi way, in Hebrew, influenced by Babylonian Judeo-Arabic traditions. The document that I just showed you in Judeo-Persian happens in a period where I would assume that the Persian minhag, or the Persian tradition, would be the dominant one, since we don't see any major Baghdadi community seniors being present. These communities were definitely bilingual. What they spoke between each other, I think are Arabic. In daily language. Arabic was the language of exchange in most of the Gulf ports, but that's based on inferences. We find all the documents from these Gulf Jewish communities that I have found are in 6 different languages, and it's kind of hard to tell what people exactly spoke and what they wrote. It's all depending on who they write to. Although, moving on to the question of modernizing and westernization, I think I struggle to place this on a scale because we have evidence pointing in many different directions. We have merchants who write in perfect London English, beautiful Latin handwriting. both Persians and Baghdadi Jewish merchants. But then at the same time, we have these community notables with the Judeo-Persian document here, who wrote in Persian because they didn't know other languages. They were dealing with a French entity, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and there were many merchants who could speak French, but the community notables had to write their documents in Judeo-Persian. And I found also French translations of this document. So they went through they took the strides to mediate the language.
Because presumably the guy in Jerusalem didn't understand.
Sorry?
The guy in Jerusalem probably had the same difficulty as you had in reading this Judeo-Persian.
The guy in Jerusalem or the guy in Paris?
The one he wrote.
Yeah, the guy in Paris who received it probably
Paris,
also struggled with it. Yeah, so he had to get a French translation. Absolutely. However, when looking at links to Jerusalem, so the Bushehr community has a strong religious connection to the Sephardic chief rabbi of Jerusalem. I didn't get into that in the talk, but there's extensive correspondence around the Arabian Peninsula between these cities, and all of that takes place in Rashi script Hebrew, so in sort of an old stylized, half modernized Hebrew. That it's not fully biblical Hebrew, but it's not the modern Hebrew we associate today with the state of Israel. So it's somewhere in between. So there we see already the tendencies of Hebrew becoming a language of daily use. But yeah, the language question is still open. We have very scattered source material. So it's, yeah. In terms of who left, to put it very crudely, on the Persian side, it's rabbis who leave. It's young rabbis. And that's why I think of this migration as religious aspiration, the attempts to generate new religious lives. Because they so much center around rabbis. In terms of the Baghdadis, it's mostly merchants that in many cases support rabbis and they support religious communities, but it's mainly trade. Yeah. Of course, both things happen in both groups, but these are sort of the general trends. The Baghdadis seem to leave the Gulf early because they have the money to do so. They have the money to go to India and make use of the opportunities there. The Persian Jewish merchants still rely on their internal networks in Iran and don't make the same leap towards India. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, Alexander.
You still have work actually, or are you just holding?
Hold it close to your mouth.
Okay, yeah, okay, it does work.
Is that a,
Not
that a
too
microphone?
Yes.
First remark, I think, Pelle, if there's a guest speaker, you should switch glasses so the audience doesn't get distracted. So my question is building a little bit further on what Knut was also asking. So the Gulfies, the Jewish Gulfies who emigrated to Israel. So you probably the answer I understand already is it's a bit more complicated. But if you, can you be a bit more precise? So persecution played a little bit of a role, perhaps emergent Zionism. There's also the traditional religious Jews going to live in Jerusalem for a while or forever. And in this case, it's enabled by better ways of getting there. But if you could say a bit more on who was going to move to Jerusalem and why, because it seems to be mostly religious. Yeah, because there's no real Zionism actually would be another motivation, because trade or a better life would not be another reason. No, can you say a bit more on that?
It's a good question. So none of these people write about Zionism. They don't use the language of Zionism themselves in the primary sources that I've been accessing. They don't mention Zionism. I mean, Zionism is hardly a word in this period, in the 1880s and 1890s. Yes, Theodor Herzl has written The Jewish State, and we have in Vienna and Germany, and we do have Zionist organizations emerging there. But even in Europe, they're in a vast minority, excuse me, very much a minority. In the Middle East, the word hardly exists. And if we define Zionism as the aspiration for a Jewish state, the aspiration of building not only a society, but also building a political entity around that society, Zionism has nothing to do with this. However, it is also part of many of the what we could call tentatively Jewish modernity, Jewish lives as integrated with modern forms of communications, global understandings of identity, thinking of Jewishness not just as something that happens in one place, but as part of a wider world religion. I don't see the term world religion used in primary sources either, but that's just a way of trying to make sense of this, where Jerusalem emerges as a center, not as a political center, but as a religious center, thanks to communication networks, etc. So I'm very hesitant to use the word Zionism about this, simply because there is no political aspiration here. These people who go, they have religious intentions, and they fully submit to the Ottoman governance and control of Jerusalem. There is no tension there, as far as I've seen. Yeah, I hope that answered your questions.
You did answer.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just jump in here and use my privilege, because I think one of my questions is a bit related to what Alexander just asked. And I know that it's a bit unfair because the cutoff point for this sort of talk today was around 1914, right? But I know that you've also written about and researched the later history of these communities. So I wanted, if you could talk a little bit about what happens if we play around with the cutoff date, right? What if we go to 1917? The year of the Balfour Declaration? What if you go to 1948, right? Because there's both a sense in which this sort of Jewish migration from Baghdad, at least, which is the case I'm familiar with, continues, right? There is this continuous migration also, after 1948, right? Many wealthy Iraqi Jews who do sort of international trade go to different parts of Iran, not to Israel, right? So there is sort of a continuous Jewish immigration. But then at the same time, you have these ruptures, right? That sort of makes that difficult. Not so much the case of Iran, that only happens later, right? But like what happens sort of when Zionism does become a thing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that opens a huge huge chapter. Yeah, just, yeah. 10 seconds. Yeah. So in terms of the Balfour Declaration in Zionism, and I mean that's a fascinating chapter that I'm still developing, which is the British government issues the Balfour Declaration in 1917, pledging for Palestine to become, is it a homeland for the Jews? A Jewish national home. A Jewish national home, 1917. For strategic reasons, we don't need to go into that now. Generally celebrated by the Zionist movement in Europe. In the Gulf, however, there is deafening silence around this Balfour Declaration, despite the fact that these people are arguably the Jews in the Middle East that are best integrated into the British global imperial network. They should have direct access to news of the Balfour Declaration, and you would hear about it immediately. There's hardly anything. But we see a change of practice in the relationship between Jews and British imperial officials. And what it turns out to be is that Gulf Jews and Iranian Jews view the Balfour Declaration as a renewed commitment of British protection for Jews. What I talked about in the 19th century, British patronage over Jewish communities, the Balfour Declaration is seen as a continuation of that same, and an affirmation of that kind of protection. And they basically think of it not necessarily as, yes, now we can go and build a state in Palestine, but more of as a confirmation, yes, the British Empire protects us and supports us, wherever that might be in the British imperial realm. And I say this because when Jews claim protection or patronage from the British Empire, they now, from 1917, increasingly turn to the British government in Palestine. So you would have Jewish communities in the Gulf who stay in the Gulf. They have no intention to leave, writing to the British government in Palestine and asking them to give them schools and give them welfare benefits, protect them against taxation from the Persian government, etc. And they don't have plans to become citizens of the British Mandate of Palestine, but they turn their requests for patronage towards the British government there. So their Zionism is a very different thing from what is generally understood as in Jewish and Zionist history.
Maybe just a very quick follow-up question, because speaking of these sort of like different competing loyalties or interests, right? you mentioned, or you showed us this primary document from the school in 1908, and just when I see the year 1908, I also think of the sort of like what's happened sort of in the Ottoman Empire with the constitution, right? And does this sort of like constitutional revolution in the Ottoman Empire give rise to new forms of like loyalties or aspirations among these communities? Does it become possible for them to imagine themselves or to aspire towards also becoming part of that sort of Ottoman identity?
The short answer is no, because the Ottoman Empire hardly has a presence, and has a very fleeting presence in the Gulf, partly on the coast of what is today Saudi Arabia, but in sort of the civic citizenship developments that we know from Palestine and from the sort of core territories of the Ottoman Empire, as far as I know, don't reach the Gulf ports. We do see some tendencies in the 1920s and 30s when the Pahlavi dynasty, the new Persian state that comes after the Qajars, tries to nationalize the Persian Gulf and turn this fleeting, overlapping oceanic space into a territory belonging to a nation state, essentially by sending out troops, instituting public education for children, inculcating a sense of Persianness in the population. Some Jews reciprocate and join into that. So we see this, what I call the school affair here. It endures for decades until the Persian government builds a Persian government school. And a lot of the Jewish kids start attending that school, and I guess become Persians to a certain extent. But what strikes me when we're looking at the sources is that the Gulf is very much a non-national space. While you have all these national projects taking place in metropoles and cities, other places in the Middle East, it doesn't really catch on. It doesn't vibe in the Gulf cities, and it always has this awkward sense of being imposed from the outside. Yeah, at least in this period that I'm looking at. What happens after the Second World War, that's a different story. But yeah.
Other questions? Yes, Nuru, if you're
Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I have a question about marriage in these Jewish communities in the Gulf. Is there evidence in your sources of Muslim-Jewish intermarriage? And secondly, what does the role of marriage play in, for example, intermarriage between Jewish families in different port cities? How does that strengthen a Jewish network in the Gulf? Thanks.
Very good question. I haven't seen any evidence of intermarriage between, say, Muslims and Jews, for example. I don't rule it out, but I haven't seen any evidence. In terms of marriage as a matchmaker, as a connector between communities, absolutely, yes, it very much happens. You would see families in Bahrain bringing in a bride from Bushehr and vice versa to solidify the connections, and particularly the religious connections. I mean, the rabbis, they quite enjoy marrying away their daughters to other communities and making alliances in that way. Interestingly, on the other side, you would also see divorces taking place through the network. So unhappy couples being shipped across the Gulf to get divorced by a more senior and competent rabbi on the other side. So it goes both ways.
Okay.
And I just wanted to add that those sort of connections through marriage between Iraqi Jewish and Iranian Jewish communities continue until the sort of 60s and 70s, actually. Yeah, that is, I think they're just as important as the sort of the trade networks, and often you cannot really tell them apart. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so while you think about other questions, if you have any, I'm just going to ask another one myself, because I really like that you sort of began the talk with this sort of like product of popular culture, the TV show, right? The Ramadan TV series, right? And I think when you look at other parts of the Middle East, sort of this ghost of the Jewish presence, or a nostalgia for a Jewish past in the Middle East, has been a part of popular culture. Not just popular culture, really, but also literature, novels, poetry for a very long time, actually. There's so many Iraqi novels that I can think of written by Iraqi authors today that to some extent deal with this sort of like absence of the Jews, right? And some of them are set in sort of like the 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, and some of them are set today. You see these like old cinemas that used to be owned
by Jews or whatever. And I'm just wondering, what explains that this happened so late in the Gulf? You know, if you have thoughts on that, why is it not until Harun that we really see this?
Good question. I think the easy. Oh, do you have an answer to it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I mean, there is a geopolitical aspect here. We'll try and go into the cultural, historical details later, but there is certainly a geopolitical aspect here. Post 9/11 Middle East, the Arab Gulf states are considered to be, they are at risk of becoming part of the enemy, not being necessarily designated as part of the axis of evil, but there is a risk of the Muslim association with terrorism, etc., that creates an incentive for many Arab Gulf states to depict themselves as liberal, as tolerant, multi-religious. And that drives an increasing narrative. We see this with Christians, we see it with religiousness, and the way, particularly the Emirates today market themselves as a global tolerant city or country. So that is certainly an aspect of it. Harun, I don't know if it's a propaganda ploy or if it just happened to be convenient timing. But it's hard to untangle them. Like the timing is a bit too convenient. So the peace agreements with Israel just a few months after is a very clear indication here there is something geopolitical taking place. Going into more speculative issues, I think there is a nostalgia for this Jewish past. I don't know if it has something to do with the emptiness of national projects in many Gulf states. States that fashion a national identity out of, not to say nothing, but local cultures and identities that certainly were not national, that are now being packaged as national. And I think a lot of people pick up on that and seek some sort of authenticity and reclaiming a more diverse past that includes Jews could maybe be an attempt to fill that with some sort of content. But that's just my speculation.
Anna, you had another question?
Yeah. We have time, right?
We do have time, yeah.
Okay, thanks. So I have another question which relates to what you were just talking about. And that relates to the issue of nationality and passports. And I completely agree with you that the sort of, what is the Qatari national identity, especially pre-1945, right? But so the answer to the question of travel becomes to have a passport at certain different points in time. So I was just wondering, because the whole world of the Indian Ocean communities have always struggled with this. I need a passport, which one? And I was wondering what would be the passport of choice, or at least, or convenience, or even possibility. And second, after the Second World War, when there actually are nation states, probably maybe before Israel, but would that be an option to take, let's say, Indian nationality or any other nationality for that matter?
After the Second World War, American and British passports emerge as the main option. There is a bias in the sources here because English language primary sources are easier to get to. So, which there is there's just a general bias there that gives a preference for American and British documents and passports. The Israeli passport from 1948 is, if you want to be mobile, it's certainly not a good option. Then you're stuck in a very, very small territory. Before the Second World War, it depends on the moment. It depends on the place. I've seen people use French passports, British Indian passports as distinct from British main nationality passports. They have several classes of passports for their colonial subjects. British Mandate Palestine has its own passport. But interestingly, I've also seen Jews, non-Persian Jews, opting for Persian Iranian passports. So like in Jerusalem, for example, you can find at certain times, specifically around the First World War, we have Ashkenazi European Jews who run to the Persian consulate to get Persian passports because that will exempt them from conscription into the Ottoman army. So there is this whole wheeling and dealing of passports here that take place not just among Gulf Jews, but also other Jewish communities, and also non-Jews, of course, that really expand the frame of this. Yeah.
And I think that sort of continues, which is partly why this history today is so relevant and important, right? Is that when you think of Iran today, it's a very different sort of like thing that comes to mind for a lot of people, right? But like for many of the Iraqi Jews who decide after 48 to not go to Israel for various reasons, Iran becomes the new home, right? Many travel to Iran and try to obtain Iranian travel documents, right? Because so there's like it happens earlier, but it continues in some ways, right?
Can I have a very brief follow-up question? Because for the Arabs inhabitants of the trucial states, when they travel, they would usually do that on a British protected person's passport, right? If I remember correctly, since they didn't issue any passports of their own.
Yes, yeah.
Would that be an option for a Jewish community to take that kind of passport in one of the trucial states?
In the trucial state specific, no. I haven't found any evidence of Jews actually settling in the trucial states. Thinking of that as the modern day territory of the Emirates, right? I've seen individual traders, but nothing that resembled communities. The closest we would get in Bahrain, and in Bahrain, it's best to remain a foreigner. So for the reasons that we talked about. So there they would very much retain their Ottoman or Qajar passports to benefit from those legal regimes. So no, I haven't seen much links to that specific legal document, but I'm sure there is something there if we just dig deep enough in the archives.
We have a question from someone online.
Oh yes, wonderful.
Alisa Kristele, she asks, have you found traces from the Jewish music used by the Jewish communities in the Gulf in the 19th and 20th century? You mentioned Sephardic connections between Bushehr and Jerusalem, but certainly Iraqi Jews also had distinct Mizrachi styles as well. Have you found histories of how these mixed in the region's Jewish music?
Only anecdotally, not. I haven't had the time or the possibility to do deep research on it. But yeah, no, there's as the question refers to, there's an extensive musical tradition among the Jewish communities of Iraq, which I'm sure took place in Basra as well, which essentially makes it part of the Gulf. In Israel in the 1950s and 60s, you have the Kuwaiti brothers, two Jewish brothers of Baghdadi Iraqi origin, from a family called the Kuwaiti family, who become famous musicians, making their career in Israel. But those are the only sort of anecdotal episodes that I know of. I haven't been able to explore it in the Gulf itself.
Yeah, sadly,
this is more of your.
Yeah,
you know more about this.
But I mean, my field of expertise is the 20th century, right? So I know very little about what happened before that, but it's safe to say that Jews in Iraq played a very, very significant role in musical production, historically and in the sort of 20th century particular. The Kuwaiti brothers, as you mentioned, Saleh and Daoud, were among the most prominent, and basically you could say wrote the soundtrack of Iraqi nightlife and modern music. They wrote songs and compositions for the most famous female divas of Iraq. They were featured on the radio. They opened their own nightclub eventually in Iraq before they left in the 50s. So I mean, the Jewish role in cultural production in many parts of the Middle East is significant, and that certainly includes musical life. But sort of before the 20th century, I am sadly not really equipped to sort of like answer that question.
I can just add very quickly that in the 19th century Gulf, it's hard enough to find the paper documents that just indicate that people were there. So moving into the question of musical practice, that's many steps ahead.
And I want to, so the Al-Kuwaiti brothers, I think, exemplifies a sort of move away from what we could call like Jewish or ritual or religious music, right? They become national Iraqi musicians, right? So the style is modern. You know, it is not, there's nothing Jewish about it except for the identities of the people playing it, you know. I think, please, we have 5 minutes.
Sorry, I don't mean to monopolize. I'm sure there are other questions, but I have just one left in my mind. Like, so you said opium. For what exactly? For what market is this?
I haven't studied this very closely, but there was in 19th century, there's a continuous export of opium from the Iranian countryside through India and towards China. So the large British Empire opium trade that went from, is it the Afghanistan, Pakistan areas towards China, also comes partly from the Persian Gulf hinterland. Yeah. I only have anecdotal sources of that. I found evidence of, for example, the Sassoon trading family entering into large opium trading contracts through Bushehr, exporting opium from Iran through Bushehr to India and further on to China.
So not from Afghanistan to India directly, but through the Gulf.
I would assume that it's grown close to the Gulf, grown in the hinterlands between Bushehr and Shiraz and around there. Often in the sources, it's called they call it medications. It's not explicitly coded as opium. So yeah.
Okay, so from the Khalij of Bergen, I want to wish you all a very nice weekend, and I want to I want you to help me join in sort of thanking our guests. And then I also want to do a little advertisement because on November 26th, we have a talk on the role of children in the Iranian constitutional revolution. So that is on the 26th of November, and I hope you can join us then. But please join me in thanking Eirik for his wonderful talk.